This video examines the tensions between Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and the Armenian Apostolic Church, highlighting the conflict rooted in his common-law marriage and the subsequent legitimacy crisis. Pashinyan's public persona and marital status clash with the Armenian Apostolic Church, a national pillar. Rising tensions and a public debate over moral authority challenge his claim to any ecclesial influence. Armenia's identity, connected to Christianity since 301 AD, faces a legitimacy crisis. The Church acts as a spiritual anchor, while government attempts to redefine national authority raise public concerns about state intrusion. Pashinyan's moral authority is questioned against canonical expectations. His marriage status tests personal credibility, as church leadership standards require sacramental conformity. Political authority cannot substitute spiritual legitimacy. The Prime Minister faces scrutiny over moral and canonical expectations, with his marital status challenging his credibility. Church leadership requires sacramental conformity, and political power does not equate to spiritual morality. The Church predates the state as the first Christian nation and is a guardian of Armenian identity. Having survived centuries of repression, its moral authority provides a crucial stabilizing force in national crises. Pashinyan defends his government's actions, challenging the Church's right to comment on political matters. He criticizes the Church for perceived interference and argues for a clear separation of state and spiritual power. Nikol Pashinyan, a journalist and activist from Ijevan, rose to power through the 2018 Velvet Revolution as an anti-corruption reformer. However, critics have observed increasing authoritarian tendencies in his charismatic yet polarizing leadership. Pashinyan utilizes family imagery, including his marriage to Anna Jacobian, extensively in political branding to emphasize a modern, secular Armenian identity. Despite this, critics question the authenticity of this public narrative. Pashinyan's common-law marriage status challenges church doctrine and sacramental conformity standards. This marital situation is publicly debated, as church standards strongly discourage divorce and a leader's conduct shapes public perception. A split exists between civil marriage, recognized by the state, and canonical marriage, which requires church sacrament. Pashinyan's common-law status lacks ecclesial standing and raises significant canonical concerns. The Armenian Church strongly discourages and does not recognize divorce, viewing the sanctity of marriage as a core tenet of faith. Divorce proceedings severely limit eligibility for church positions, with exceptions rarely granted. Public perception is divided. Armenians value traditional family structures, linking marriage legitimacy to a leader's credibility. Church supporters question Pashinyan's example, while secular supporters dismiss canonical concerns, reflecting broader cultural tensions. Common-law marriage is not a recognized sacramental union and lacks ecclesial blessing. Considered an irregular union, this status creates barriers to ecclesial leadership roles and questions the leader's moral example. The public remains split. Traditional Armenian values tie a leader's moral credibility to marriage legitimacy. While secular supporters dismiss canonical concerns, church supporters continue to question Pashinyan's marital example. The conflict challenges Armenia's national identity, which is deeply connected to Christianity since 301 AD. Government attempts to redefine national authority are met with public concern about state intrusion, and the legitimacy crisis shapes the country's future direction. Armenia's geopolitical identity is tied to its religious history. The rising tensions between the state and church, fueled by the legitimacy crisis, challenge the nation's direction and have significant geopolitical implications. The Church expects political leaders to model a sacramental life. Pashinyan's non-canonical marriage status undermines his moral authority, as the Church views marriage as theological, not political, which is magnified by state interference. Pashinyan's political future is intertwined with this legitimacy crisis. His public conduct influences his long-term credibility, and increasing authoritarian tendencies have been noted as the conflict challenges Armenia's national identity. The current legitimacy crisis and rising tensions between the Armenian Church and state are shaping Armenia's future direction. The public debate over moral authority continues, with arguments for a clear separation of state and spiritual power. The Church expects leaders to respect the sacramental order and view marriage as a sacred covenant. Governance is rooted in canon law, and political leaders are expected to honor church-state boundaries and consistent moral standards. Historically, the Armenian Church predates the state and is a vital cultural and spiritual anchor. Its moral authority, rooted in centuries of continuity, has allowed it to survive genocide, exile, and Soviet repression. To recap, Pashinyan's common-law marriage status challenges church doctrine, which strongly discourages divorce. His personal conduct and marital legitimacy are tied to his moral credibility and public perception. Pashinyan is taking a political gamble by defending his actions and arguing for state and spiritual separation. He challenges the church's political commentary and criticizes it for perceived interference. Key takeaways include a significant crisis of political and spiritual legitimacy in Armenia. Rising church-state tensions and the public debate over moral authority are amplified by Pashinyan's common-law marriage status. The legitimacy crisis is currently shaping the future direction of church-state relations in Armenia. Rising tensions and the debate over moral authority continue, alongside arguments for a clear separation of powers. In conclusion, Armenia faces a deep crisis of legitimacy that shapes the future of church-state relations. The ongoing public debate over national moral authority challenges the country's identity and overall direction. The state has employed tactics like legislative attempts to restructure church governance and increase oversight. These efforts, including attempts to control church property and apply pressure on bishops, are framed as, quote, modernization. Pashinyan's political future is tied to the legitimacy crisis. His public conduct influences his credibility, especially as critics note increasing authoritarian tendencies while the conflict challenges the national identity. The current legitimacy crisis is defining Armenia's future trajectory. Tensions are escalating between the Armenian church and state, with an ongoing public debate about moral authority and the push for clear separation of powers. High-profile detentions of bishops raise public alarm, as the Armenian church views these as state intimidation. Accusations are perceived as politically motivated, leading to public protests and concern from international observers. Armenia's future trajectory is being shaped by the legitimacy crisis and rising church-state tensions. The conflict challenges the national identity, while the public continues to debate who holds the national moral authority. The government is attempting to seize control of church property, citing a, quote, modernization narrative to justify legislative restructuring of church governance. Legal battles escalate tensions as the church asserts constitutional protections. State actions are attempting to weaken the Catholicos' authority by promoting alternative clerical voices. Growing state influence in ecclesial appointments undermines the church's historical governance and is viewed as an existential threat. The legitimacy crisis is setting the course for the church-state trajectory in Armenia. Rising tensions and the public debate over moral authority continue, with discussions focusing on the clear separation of state and spiritual power. The optics of Pashinyan's non-canonical marriage severely undermine state attempts to control the church. Public opinion sees a serious mismatch between his claims and conduct, magnifying scrutiny of his personal life. Armenia's constitution guarantees religious freedom and church autonomy. State takeover attempts violate these constitutional norms, leading legal scholars to warn of an authoritarian drift, while the public debates the legality of reforms. The church is central to Armenian national identity, and leaders are expected to model traditional moral values. Pashinyan's non-canonical marriage status tests his credibility and severely undermines his moral authority, amplifying the legitimacy crisis. From a canonical perspective, common-law marriage is not a recognized sacramental union. This lack of ecclesial legitimacy hurts leadership influence, as canon law disqualifies any claim to authority based on non-canonical status. The legitimacy crisis presents Pashinyan's final political test. His public conduct will influence his long-term political credibility, as the conflict and his increasing authoritarian tendencies challenge Armenia's national identity. Canonical marriage requires the church's sacrament and approval, while civil marriage is recognized by the state. Common law marriage lacks recognized ecclesial standing, raising significant canonical concerns. The church will likely continue resisting state control, prioritizing moral authority and tradition. Expect continued public debate on church-state separation, with the church citing constitutional protections for property. This concludes our video on the tensions between the Armenian church and state. Thank you for watching.